Hello, my name is Susan Hirata, and I'm the programming director for DisOrient. I'm excited to welcome you to the 17th annual DisOrient Asian American Film Festival of Oregon. For 17 years, DisOrient has maintained this platform to celebrate the stories and voices of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Today, it's my pleasure to host this conversation with the filmmaker of Reparations and Not Your Model Minority, John Osaki. John is the executive director of the Japanese Community Youth Council. John got into filmmaking to share the stories and to amplify the stories of Asian Americans on a wider scale. So welcome, John.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you back at DisOrient. This year, we have two of your films screening together, Reparations and Not Your Model Minority. So I first want to, I'm first going to talk about, we're going to talk about reparations, but I'd like you to give us a little bit about your personal history.
Sure. So I'm a third generation Japanese American, born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. My father was incarcerated during World War II in the Tule Lake Segregation Center. My mother was incarcerated at the Gila River concentration camp in Arizona. And I think that they both were very active in social justice issues. While I was growing up, they were in many ways not the model minority, in their own very quiet, in sometimes quiet, sometimes not so quiet ways, were very outspoken about not just Japanese Americans, but about the many ways that this country has oppressed communities of color and have not atoned for those. So that is kind of the environment that I grew up in, and it very much informs my filmmaking.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So in talking about reparations and thinking about it, I'm thinking that people have a hard time wrapping their minds around reparations. Reparations in this context is different from for example, the reparations to Japanese Americans that was given out because those were not given to, that was given to people who were actually incarcerated. And when they think about reparations for Black Americans, the conversation is that there are no longer people who alive who were actually slaves. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this, help us wrap our minds around what this means, reparations for Black Americans.
Sure. So, I'm very fortunate that through my work at the Japanese Community Youth Council, we were created by students who are part of the Third World liberation strikes at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State. Right. And that whole premise of working in solidarity with other communities is really kind of foundational to our work at my organization. And so because of that, I've been very fortunate to have very long-standing partnerships with organizations in the Black community, with leaders in the Black community. And so I really relied on them to tell me this story, because quite honestly, I just knew bits and pieces, like probably most of the audience, about what the Black reparations movement was about, what they were asking for. And so I drew upon, some of my colleagues who were incredibly gracious about sharing this story and to help other communities really understand what this is about. And so I think, first and foremost, what I took away from what they were sharing with me during the interviews is that this is not just about slavery. It is very much about the legacy of slavery and really the ongoing forms of systemic racism that have continued to affect the Black community for centuries. So I think that those who oppose reparations for the Black community have narrowly tried to create narratives that it's only about, repairing damage for those who were enslaved, but it really isn't. It's much broader than that. And if you take a look through history, you can just see systematically how effort after effort was made to suppress the progress of the Black community. And I always like to make this point is that, so of course, my father and my mother received reparations, right, for their incarceration during World War II. And something that I learned during this project is that Congressman John Conyers introduced HR 40, which was essentially a very similar bill to what was just passed by Congress in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act, which authorized redress and reparations for Japanese Americans. He patterned his bill very much after that, and he introduced it only 1 year after, so 1989. And when he introduced his bill, he could not get a single co-sponsor. And essentially the reaction from the American public was silence and denial. And so it just speaks to how this country treats communities differently, right? And that there has been this very consistent, persistent way in which white supremacy has affected the Black community and really led to this really dramatic racial wealth gap that we still have in this country today.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's partly because, Black Americans have been so essential to the building of this country and to recognize the injustices that were done, but just kind of break down the grand narratives of this country? Hard to look at that.
Absolutely.
Directly.
Absolutely. Again, something that I learned through this project is that there were supposed to be reparations, right? Yeah. When slaves were emancipated, there was supposed to be measures put in place to help them become, self-sufficient. And that was always part of the plan. And it only got derailed because Abraham Lincoln got assassinated, right? And so that essentially through everything that all the plans that were made to give, freed slaves an opportunity to build wealth and become self-sufficient were completely thrown out the window. And so I think that's really important for people to remember is that from the very get-go, things went haywire for freed slaves. And so I think we are still at a place where that has really never been addressed. And I'm in these conversations all the time, and people say, well, what about Oprah Winfrey? And what about, all these Black Americans who have achieved wealth? And, what I point out to them is that even if you take all the wealthiest Black Americans in this country, when you compare the racial wealth gap to white Americans, it's still getting wider. Even with all the success and achievements that Black Americans have made, it's still getting wider. And so I think we have to reckon with those set of circumstances, and that it's not by accident, that there were very intentional ways that Black Americans were, suppressed from owning property, from building wealth within their families. I mean, so my family, even though they were incarcerated, they were eventually able to secure home loans, move into certain neighborhoods, whereas that process was significantly more difficult for Black Americans. And you can just go back and look at, at history and data and the ways in which they were denied opportunities to own property. And it's very clear that, there are reasons for this wealth gap in this country.
Yeah, I think your film does an excellent job of laying that history out for everyone to just be able to follow and understand the history of our country, because it's not history that's talked about all that much and laid out so clearly like that, and we can follow that line all the way through our country. Can you talk a little bit about the community building that happened? Well, like you talked about, even the organization that you worked with back in the day, there was this community building with Asian Americans and Black Americans and just communities of color that I think strengthened all the communities and helped further the communities. Can you talk a little bit about that? And
Sure, absolutely. So I think it's kind of, it's sort of ironic, but I've been focusing a lot, like a really pivotal person in this whole dynamic is Ronald Reagan. And I say that because he was the governor of California in 1968 when the student strikes broke out, San Francisco State and UC Berkeley, and he was really enraged by it. And took very, very draconian actions to try to suppress it. And I focus on that because to me, as I'm doing my research, it's very clear that he saw the power of Black, Latinx, and Asian American and Native American communities coming together. I mean, that period really was the birth of ethnic studies throughout this country. It also led to the creation of so many community organizations like mine. We just turned 52 this year, and it's because of that whole movement that we've been able to serve hundreds of thousands of children and youth over that time period. I mean, that was really the power of these communities coming together in solidarity, and I think he took notice of that. And I say that because when he became president, he took very intentional actions to try to divide communities of color. While he was dismantling a lot of the programs that were created in response to the civil rights movement, the racial wealth gap, the inequities between communities of color, a lot of those programs that were created to address those things, he was dismantling them while he was lifting up and praising the Asian American community. And I don't think it's a mistake that while all this was happening, he was initially against, but eventually was convinced that he should sign the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided reparations for the Japanese American community. So, this whole effort to divide communities of color, to use Asian Americans as a wedge, is really part of a very intentional playbook. Because those who support a white supremacist agenda in this country understand that if our communities came together, we would build so much power that in many ways we would make progress in a way that many folks who want to keep this country white would not be happy with.
Yeah, and we're still seeing the damage that was done with the dismantling of all those programs today. I mean, that's where we're at right now. Yeah, so that's a great segue into your other film, Not Your Model Minority. Can you tell me a little bit more? So talk a little bit more about that, the how that wedge is being used, and even the complicity of the Asian Americans in that, in the enabling systemic racism because of that.
Sure. So, again, I learned so much from that project. And I think one of the things that surprised me was, well, first of all, I was really grateful I was able to interview Ellen Wu, professor from Indiana University, and she's written a book about the model minority myth, and so was able to share that, it really was a liberal project, right, to demonstrate that, this whole narrative was about proving that Asian Americans could assimilate into this country. And that was one of the justifications for Japanese Americans being incarcerated during World War II, is the assertion that we were unassimilable, right? Which seems ridiculous right now. But that was one of the assertions, that we could never assimilate into American society. And so Asian Americans went out of their way, right, to prove that they could assimilate, they could be good Americans. And that was really a survival strategy, right? That was a way for Asian Americans to move beyond being targeted and scapegoated to being accepted, to making progress, for doors to be open for Asian Americans. And once again, I bring up the Ronald Reagan situation because again, what ended up happening though is that this narrative got weaponized, right? And it was used very specifically as a rebuke of the civil rights movement. And actually one of the first forms of scholarship around this was an article in 1966, which actually identified Japanese Americans as the original model minority. But it was really, it's interesting. And what I think Asian Americans have to understand is that, while there were implied, compliments towards Asian Americans, and look how much they've overcome racism and how much they've achieved by working hard. But really, with every compliment, really was a rebuke of the Black community, right? It was a direct attack on the ways in which they were speaking out, demanding equality, and being very, at the time, incredibly forceful about it. And so it really was a way to, try to rebuff the civil rights movement. And so I think, given that history, and then of course, what happens is that because of the progress that's been made during that movement, and how there's much more awareness and openness to communities of color and equality, and all the changes that were brought about that time, comes the 1968 Immigration Act, right? Which then reopens the doors to Asian immigration into this country. But unfortunately, what happens is that many of those Asians that immigrate post 1965 are educated, right? Many are wealthy. They're not like the previous immigrants, like my grandparents, who were, just trying to survive, incredibly poor, looking, the only reason they came to this country is because they were in such dire straits. They were looking for a better life. Well, the 1968 wave of Asian immigrants was completely different, right? And they, unfortunately, are not in tune with how they got there in the first place. That it was really the environment that was created by the civil rights movement that led to this act being passed. There isn't that connection. They came over here, they found opportunity because of everything that had just happened in this country, but there isn't always an awareness of how the Black community had to sacrifice for those changes to be made, that literally and figuratively, Black leaders took a bullet for the civil rights of every American, right? There isn't that kind of consciousness amongst many of the newer immigrant Asian families and individuals. So I think that's part of the challenge. And that's part of what we wanted to do with Not Your Model Minority, is to really shine a spotlight on that, and for us to understand how Asian Americans have so often been used, right? And it's really not about lifting up the Asian American community. It's really about using us in a way to address the issues with other communities, right? And so I
and
think
and
that
it's
was,
so effective, isn't it? Because
it is.
like I think you say in your film, at the same time, what it does is it makes, for example, Japanese Americans keep their head low, because you're gonna, okay, you can have this place as the model minority, and you don't want to um, be targeted. So you're going to keep your mouth shut, and you're going to, go along with that because it keeps you safe. And then it also makes the other Asian population see that what happened to the Japanese Americans, how easily they were able to get rounded up and incarcerated, and nobody wants that to happen to their community. So it's so effective.
It really is. And, the point that I've been making in conversations about this film is that it really hasn't kept us safe, right?
Yeah,
Because
right.
as much as we,
Right.
like there's this saying, right, in Japanese culture, the nail that sticks out gets hit, right? And as much as we want to subscribe to that, when there are national emergencies, when there are economic crises, when this country needs a scapegoat, it still finds a way too often to blame Asian American communities, right? And we're seeing that play out right now in this country. So
Right.
I think it's so important that our communities understand that playing the model minority will not keep us safe. It will grant us limited privileges, but what it does is it enables and it sustains the system of racism in this country.
Yeah.
Right. And I think we have to be very conscious about how we are enabling that, right? And by feeding into that narrative that they're good and bad minorities, and good minorities act like this. And if you do, then you'll get these things, you'll be left alone. But the reality is that's not true. We're seeing that play out right now. And I think to me, that's in part why so many Asian Americans are like enraged about what's going on right now, because they have been the good minority, right? They played by the rules and they've done what they thought was expected of them from the white power structure. And yet here we are being targeted once again.
When that has kind of always been underlying the narrative. I really appreciate in Not Your Model Minority how it's said that when Black Americans protested and worked for civil rights, they essentially worked for the civil rights for all of us. Their efforts really made everything better for everybody else, which is always the case in our history. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think, in both films, one of the through lines that really comes across is that if we as Asian Americans believe that there's a level playing field in this country, we are just not paying attention.
Yeah.
There has never been a level playing field. Yeah. There is still not a level playing field. So when it comes to education and all these other issues, we really have to be thoughtful about, and I'm very convinced of this, and this is part of the message in the film, is that the only way we're going to make significant progress in addressing systemic racism in this country is together, right? Is to work, just like in 1968 at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley, where communities of color came together. There's incredible power and opportunity when that happens, right? And as long as we're brought into these situations that divide our communities, we're never going to achieve that.
Yeah.
And that it's really critical, I think, and part of why I made these films, to think about how do we lift up other communities.
Yeah.
Right. And that's really, to me, ultimately, if we want to address anti-Asian hate in this country, it's really about lifting up other communities and working with them and building relationships and building power so that we can address the systemic racism that fueled the anti-Asian hate to begin with.
Yeah, I hope that your film really serves as that call to action and waking up to Asian American communities to that we need to be intentional about being allies and working collectively together.
And I think we have to have some really important conversations within our own community,
Absolutely.
right? About ways that we, there are many instances where there is anti-Blackism, Blackness, there is racism towards other Asian communities. I mean, there's still a lot of work we have to do within our own community. And I think that is part of the message as well, is it can't just be, the message can't just be don't hate us, right? It can't just be about that. It also has to be, what is the work that we have to do within our own community? And so one of the things that we're going to be doing with Not Your Model Minority is that we're going to, we're working right now on a Chinese translated version because we really want to reach immigrant communities, right? Who are frankly so susceptible to some of these very conservative agendas and brought in a way where they're used right now, right? We're seeing some of that play out in the Harvard case, where this, it was really a very conservative group that brought this forward and needed Asian faces to put on it. And so I think, what we want to do is really reach out to as many communities as possible to have these conversations and to talk openly about the work that we still have to do.
Yeah, yeah. Also, can you give us a little bit of update on HB 40 and what's happening with that now?
Sure. So last year, it finally, after many, many years, was moved out of the House Judiciary Committee. And I believe it's up to over 200 co-sponsors, which is the most that it's ever had. So it really is as close as it's ever been to being heard on the floor for a full floor vote, but it's not there yet. So that's where it currently stands. But in the meantime, there are a lot of really meaningful reparations efforts going on at the local level, going on at the state level. My colleague who I worked with on these films, Attorney Don Tamaki, is on the California Reparations Task Force. He's the only non-Black member on it, but it's because he feels this deep obligation as a Japanese American whose family received reparations, that he wants to be a part of bringing healing to the Black community.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that we can put some of links to some of that information, or where how people can actively get involved and make their voices heard around supporting those efforts. Hopefully we can put that on our film page or something like that.
That'd be great.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, John. I was also wondering if you have other projects right now happening. What's coming down the pike from you?
So I do. Somehow I'll figure out how to get this done. But I'm currently working on a project that is going to document the long-term impacts of the ethnic studies movement in this country, specifically Asian American studies. And I think that, so again, my organization is a living example of an outcome of Asian American studies in this country, how young people participating in those programs are so much more aware, are empowered about their own communities, their own histories. And so this film will focus on outcomes in different communities on the West Coast, on the East Coast. I'm going to be focusing on some really amazing efforts that are being made in the Midwest, specifically in the state of Indiana, where they're starting their first ever Asian American Studies program. Also going to be focusing on the state of Michigan, where they just passed, the state passed a law to mandate Asian American Studies in the core curriculum, K through 12. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how this is playing out in different parts of the country, and really what not a lot of people have drawn a straight line between Asian American studies and all the accomplishments that have resulted because of it.
That's wonderful. Well, we look forward to seeing that when you're done. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, and mostly thank you for all your continued commitment to social justice and the work that you do. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And I'm looking forward to visiting Eugene again one of these days.
Yeah, we'd love to have you. Always welcome.